Hello and welcome to the Digital Museum. This morning I have for you Professor Sarah Ward, and she's going to be talking about the underwater archaeology of China and Southeast Asia. So Sarah Ward is a visiting professor of the Dalian Maritime University, and she does a lot of underwater archaeology. She's a diver. So over to you, Sarah, if you want to introduce yourself, say a little bit, and then we can go into your presentation.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, hello, everybody. 大家好, as we would say here in China. It's my absolute honor, privilege, and great pleasure to be with you today. My first time at the Digital Museum, so I'm very much looking forward to it. And so, if I may, I might just jump straight into sharing my screen and we'll kick off.
Yes, please do.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. For those of you that don't know me, that's right, I'm Sarah Ward. I'm a Professor of Maritime Archaeology at Dalian Maritime University. Now, for those, yes, so small tech issues we've been having today in China. So good evening. I am a professor at Dalian Maritime University. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Dalian, it is located on China's northeast Yellow Sea coast in the beautiful port city of Dalian. And so that you know where I am, I'm just going to show me to you on the map. So that's us, just in northeast China, in the peninsula that is below Korea. So today I want to talk to you about underwater archaeology in China, but I want you to indulge me for one small moment, because I know many of you will have never heard of DMU. So we are China's key maritime institution. We are an IMO Centre of Excellence for teaching, and we have been lovingly, and I say lovingly, called China's Cradle of Navigators for our 110 years. But I digress. So returning to our topic. It is China's underwater archaeology, and I'm also going to look at the materiality of its maritime connections with Southeast Asia, and I will use Cambodia as a little case in point. But I think if you are aware of underwater archaeology in the region at all, you will know that no discussion of maritime archaeology in China is complete without mentioning Nanhai 1. So Nanhai 1, that you can see, is a Southern Song dynasty merchantman dated to approximately 1127 to 1279 CE. So here you can see a 3D rendering of the ship and the incredible porcelain that you can see carried in her holds. Now, normally I would never mention a treasure hunter in a talk about underwater archaeology, but Nanhai 1 was discovered by Mike Hatcher. In this instance, I think it's really quite necessary to talk about him because he's the man who compelled China to develop its underwater archaeology capacity. So as I mentioned, Hatcher located the Nanhai 1. He did it while he was searching for Geldermalsen, the remains of a 17th century Dutch East Indiaman that was known to have been lost in the South China Sea. Now, he went on to salvage, reportedly, somewhere between 160,000 and 240,000 artifacts, predominantly ceramic, from Geldermalsen that were subsequently sold at auction as the Nanking cargo. In 1987, after he had recovered about 200 artifacts from Nanhai 1 using a grab bucket, and those artifacts were destroyed, China, having been through a bitter experience with the Nanking cargo, where it couldn't even afford to bid on, well, not even afford to bid, but couldn't afford the starting bid on one of those 240,000 porcelains, it immediately prohibited Hatcher from further exploration of that ship, which is a good thing. Because in 1988, Zhang Wei, and you can see him there, the father of underwater archaeology in China, was appointed to establish the first underwater archaeology unit here. He appointed his own team. They trained in the US under George Bass at INA. And in 1989, they led the first investigation of Nanhai 1. So in that investigation, only one piece of porcelain was discovered. And sadly, excavations were halted for 10 years, partly due to a lack of funds and partly due to the need for more capacity building in China. So skip forward to 2007, 9 offshore excavations were undertaken, and you can see that here on your screen with some of the artifacts were recovered. But 2007 is important because that's the year that Nanhai 1 was recovered intact from the seabed. It was in 25 meters of water. You can see here it coming out of the water. I'd say Mary Rose style, but this was not excavated substantially on the seabed. It was recovered intact, moved onto a barge and shipped to shore. And here you can see it coming into shore on Haling Island. And once it was brought onshore, it was rolled. And I say rolled for a reason, because here you can see the ship and the seabed that contains it in this container being rolled on airbags up the beach. And I really mean rolled into the museum. And you can see on the left-hand side of your screen there, that's the purpose-built Guangdong Maritime Silk Road Museum. And you can see the tracks up the beach from where the ship was brought into that museum. And she came in via that large oval window that you can see just behind the crane in the front of that image. So where is it? Because I like to show you where things are in China. That red pin is the Maritime Silk Road Museum in Guangdong province in Hailing Island, southern part of China. So here we've moved in through that large window. We're looking at Nanhai 1 in a tank. The initial idea was to keep it submerged and excavate it as you would offshore. But unfortunately, there were some issues with the filtration system. So the water was lowered, as you can see here, and eventually the excavation was conducted dry. We say dry, although the remains were still waterlogged and significantly damp. Excavations have been ongoing since 2007 in parallel with artifact recording. And you can see here that the museum visitors were able to watch that excavation as it was in process. As they were able to see the artifact recording that I mentioned, together with the cleaning, desalination of the material. And at one point, the conservation requirements were so great that the excavation had to be paused. We have deconcretion of the artifacts and ongoing timber hull stabilization, because now there's nothing but those introduced supports to keep the hull intact, and ongoing timber analysis. So the site's been subject to full recording. This is a shot that was taken at the same time as that opening photo I showed you. You can see the ceramic still significantly in her hold. 2 and 3D, well, 3D laser scanning was undertaken together with 2D renders, such as the plan view of the ship that you can see here in front of you. So to date, Nanhai 1 has recovered over, or produced, I should say, over 160,000 artifacts of its own, and that work is still ongoing. But like maritime or underwater archaeology in most countries, it's not just about one ship. So in China, what else do we have other than the Nanhai 1? Most of you will know about the Guangzhou ship, but I'm purposely not going to mention her today because I want to focus on that which is either still underwater or recently excavated. Many of you will know that China has been on a large drive, not only to source ancient material underwater, but with a specific focus on Silk Route shipwrecks. So I'd like to draw your attention now to 4 of those. The Nan'ou 1, the Huaguangjia 1, or Huaguang Reef 1, Wangjia 1. And you can see the recovery locations or the wrecked locations on the map here, along with Nanhai number 1. So where shall we start? Let's start with Nan'ou 1. It was accidentally discovered by a group of local fishermen in 2007. The maritime archaeologists on the call will know that's predominantly how most significant shipwrecks are found. It's almost 20, or just over actually 25.5 meters in length, 7.5 meters wide. Like Nanhai 1, it was a merchant ship and it sank in Sandianjin off the coast of Nan'ou Island, which is about 5.6, almost 6 nautical miles from Shantou in Guangdong. So also in the south of China, similar to Nanhai 1. Interestingly, the remains of Nan'ou 1 are the first late Ming dynasty. Ming dynasty is from 1368 to 1644, and it coincides with the European or British medieval period. This wreck dates to the Wanli Emperor reign, and that's 1573 to 1620. So it's the first late Ming Dynasty wreck and the first one from Wanli period to have been discovered in Chinese waters and investigated by the Chinese team. Over 20,000 artifacts were discovered and recovered, and you can see some of those on the screen here. Primarily, they were blue and white porcelain. We have dragon pattern jars, potteries, ironware, and a significant amount of copperware. Also recovered were soil samples, metal samples, and the remains of animals and plants that were on the ship. And that's not unusual because we know at that point in time, a lot of the ships were growing and producing their own food and having livestock on board to feed the sailors. It was significant though, so significant in fact that it was named one of the 10 greatest national archaeological discoveries in 2010 and singled out for its significance for the research on Sino-foreign maritime exchange in the late Ming Dynasty. And that's Ming Dynasty is really the period that I'm focused on. So moving on to Huaguang Reef 1. This is also interesting for the fact that it's a Southern Song Dynasty period, so same as Nanhai 1. It sank off the coast of the Shisha Islands For those that aren't Chinese, you might know that as the Paracel Islands, which are in the 9-dashed line map of China. So it's about 330 kilometers southeast of China's Hainan province, again in the South China Sea. And the South China Sea has been a significant focus of Chinese maritime archaeological activity, predominantly in the last 10 years. Again, it was discovered by fishermen, slightly smaller though, at 20 meters long, 6 meters wide. And you can see here the team working on Huaguang Reef, and it was only at a depth of 3 meters. So in 2007, an excavation, well, actually an investigation, was organized by the National Museum of China and the Hainan Provincial Administration. And unsurprisingly, the wreck was heavily looted and had been severely damaged by treasure hunters, although the large majority of the timber hull was preserved, and 10,000 pieces of pottery and porcelain were retrieved. Most of that was from the Fujian and the Guangdong hills, which is common for Silk Route shipwrecks. Now, the ship's currently undergoing conservation, so I wanted to show you a little bit about this. This is it in the desalination tanks at the Hainan Provincial Museum. And you can also see some conservation work being undertaken on the bronzeware. And again, drying of timbers, but this is in preparation for a full museum reconstruction of that vessel. So in the eyes of China, this shipwreck is undeniable evidence of what was, by the Song dynasty, a very well-established maritime trade route. The term maritime silk road or route is a little bit controversial, but I think it's a very simple term for a very complex phenomena, and one that is really easy for us to understand. And it's considered that although the Ming dynasty was the height of China's pre-modern shipping activity, the Song and Yuan dynasties, and we're seeing a lot of wrecks from Song dynasty, were the height of that Silk Road trade. So Huaguang Jiao, or Huaguang Reef shipwreck, is significant because it is the oldest ship remains that have been found in, let's say, open seas, and it's the first open sea or high seas excavation that China has undertaken. And at that time, the reason I corrected myself to say investigation and not excavation, although it was excavated, further surveys brought us an additional 10 other shipwreck sites and some submerged landscape sites that are located around Shisha and Nansha Islands. So the third wreck is the Wanjiao wreck. This is another merchant ship that sank off the coast of Fujian province in Pingtan County. It's called the Bowl Reef number 1, so Wanjiao. Wan is bowl. It's a smaller vessel, so potentially a private trading vessel, 13.8 meters long, 3 meters wide, and had a reasonably shallow draft of 1 meter. 17,000 pieces of porcelain were recovered by the team. 10,000 of these were an exceptionally rare blue and white porcelain that dates back to the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, which is 1654 to 1722, and that is in Qing dynasty. So the last dynasty before New China. It was discovered in 2005, excavated in 2008. And I like to point out the most significant aspects of each of these. And there's 2 here, both are in relation to the porcelain, but one I'll share with you is a small plate and I don't have a photo of it, so forgive me, but it was decorated with plum blossoms. That doesn't seem so unusual for Chinese tasu or porcelain, but this was inscribed with shuanglong or double dragons in simplified Chinese characters. Now that's what's important here, because the simplified characters were only adopted in printing and after 1949. So it's quite unusual that we have 300-year-old porcelain with what appears to be simplified characters that are on their own. So they're not part of any discernible pattern. So this is the big mystery of Wanjiao 1. It's also, despite the porcelain, not been confirmed, if you like, to be a silk route shipwreck, and work is still ongoing. So that's our kind of silk route shipwreck foray. So I wanted to talk now a little bit about, I'll say my maritime China, and that is looking beyond seafaring to inland waterways and water transport. So I want to speak of China's waterways, the significance of their development, particularly in relation to the Sino-Foreign Maritime Exchange, that we've seen evidence in the shipwreck, but that we are exploring in my recent research and that of my centre. So I'm going to take you now to Taichung. And the reason I'm doing this is that I want to talk more about, I guess, the two projects that we're doing. One is on globalization of Sino-Foreign Maritime Exchange. So that's looking at all of China's maritime contacts with other countries from the earliest evidence to the present day. And that evidence really dates back to the Han Dynasty and the first recorded Silk Route voyage to Southeast Asia in 111 BCE. And we're also working on a project looking at the history and the development of inland water transport. So I've talked about the former project being based mostly on seafaring, but this latter project, while it considers inland waterways, it's also looking at transit points, cultural economies, engineering infrastructure, so the canals, the locks, the weirs, as well as the archaeology of the inland boats and ships. And we have potentially, and I say potentially because the Dutch have a similar example, but the earliest Neolithic canoe, which currently is dated to about 8,600 BCE, very similar to the press boat in the Netherlands. But let's go back to Taichung. You can see it here on the map. It's a port city on the coast of Jiangsu province. It was built around, or has developed around, Lujiagang or Lu family harbour in Taichung. Now, I've shown it here in 2005 on the 600th anniversary of the departure of eunuch Admiral Zhong He on the first of his 7 voyages to the Western Ocean. I'm sure you've all by now heard of Zhong He, and that Western Ocean is what we would today call the Indian Ocean. Lujiagang, or Taichung, I guess, was the staging post for the Zhong He fleets. So he would come down river, wait here, load people, supplies onto the ships, and when the monsoon was suitable, would travel down through initially Southeast Asia and onto the Indian Ocean. So it's significant in the Ming Dynasty, partly for its cultural interactions, partly for its material exchange. And here's the man of the moment, Zhong He, and his fleets. But that exchange and transmission of knowledge and culture and food went well past the simple trade of goods and even had an impact on geopolitics at that time. But I also digress. So I want to come back to this point in time that's really significant. It's worth noting, though, that China has 3 million square kilometres of territorial seas, and that's not excluding the claimed area in the South China Sea. It also has one of the largest coastlines in the world at over 18,000 kilometres. But it's the country's unique topographical features, high mountainous regions in the west and north, and those low coastal plains in the east that force the development of the inland waterways. So if we're looking at Ming Dynasty, that's just to come back to the Zhonghe voyages and the time that I've been talking about. Here is a map of his journeys. You can see departing from Taichung through Southeast Asia, across the Middle East and to Africa. Now, the inland waterways, they're three significant, but something that I want to focus on are those man-made waterways. So the Grand Canal is, by any definition of the word grand, it is to date, or to our knowledge, the longest man-made canal in the world at about, and was built about 5,000 years ago. But because we've been talking about underwater archaeology, I just want to digress from the canals for a moment and show you these Ming Dynasty ships that were discovered in Taichung when the canal was being dredged. These are, well, one of them actually was in really fantastically good condition. The second, not so much, but it's the first inland ships, and they're really not riverboats, they're ships, because one's 13 meters long and has more than one deck, and 600 artifacts were also recovered from those. So when I say that the inland waterways are significant, they truly are significant, and China wouldn't be what it is today without those developments. But the second most significant man-made canal is Lingchu, or Ling Canal. It was built about 2,000 years ago, and it evidences the world's first locks and first weirs. And that is now being assessed for World Heritage nomination. So these canals were built to transport goods and people from the inland regions to the coast. Once at the coast, then China's coastal ports and harbours, like Liujiagang and Taichung, which was really the point of connection for that harbour, as transit points since that first voyage in 111 BCE. So China has a long history of seafaring, but I should say navigation for my Chinese colleagues that are listening, because seafaring isn't particularly a term that's particularly used here. So I want to talk about navigation in acknowledgement that most of China's ancient seafaring did not take place on seas and oceans, but instead on canals, lakes, and rivers. So it is navigation, but it's also what feeds the 2,000 years of Sino-foreign maritime exchange. So exchange of goods, ideas, knowledge, people, and culture and community. And that exchange commenced in the Han Dynasty, as I've mentioned, and it not just helped China build into, at least the Ming Dynasty, one of the greatest seafaring nations in the world, but created or helped create some of the most historically significant civilizations. And those of you that feel that the Maritime Silk Route is too Sino-centric, Himanshu, if you're watching, I'd love to have a conversation with that at the end, because it is very true that although I'm talking about this from China's point of view, and it is China pushing to the West again today, that there was as much, if not more, trade coming to the East as there was going to the West. That custom, if you like, of Sino-foreign maritime exchange dramatically altered in the Ming Dynasty, and that's because of Emperor Yongle. He is, I guess, was, like every Chinese ruler for more than 1,000 years, desperate to incorporate those foreign polities into his system. And I say his because that's how it was perceived at that time, certainly by him, of hierarchical and tributary relationships, which centered on the Ming court. So his was an exceptional, yet traditional in some ways, extension of Chinese military might and power. It was an unorthodox, certainly very unorthodox at that time, use of maritime resources in an old structure that was predominantly agrarian. And his actions and his desire to conquer culminated really in those aforementioned Zhonghe voyages. And they took place from 1405 to 1433. And what you're seeing here is the typical image of a Zhonghe ship from that period. So back to our timeframes of China, and I'm taking you now to still Taichung, but in the Western Han, when it was just a small county level city, or barely be called a city, in Suzhou. And Taichung was given that name because in Chinese it means great granary. And during the Three Kingdoms period, the Wu Kingdom built the grain store, the granary, to keep food stored close to the port. And this is what really initiated that town's booming economy, improved its transportation, and the name was given in recognition of it being, at that point in time, China's major grain store. So by the Yuan dynasty, the ancient town was further expanded, not just into a civil community, but into a military base in which the local authority built moats, town walls, streets. And interestingly, it was recognized not only in China, but in some other documents as being the #1 port in the world. So the abundant storages, the excellent harbor, and the advanced technologies of ship manufacture form the basis of this confluence of activity that happened at Taichung, which is part of the reason why Zhonghe chose this as his staging place. So this is Taichung today, located in a river sea transit zone between Nanjing, which was the Ming capital, and the East China Sea. And there's Nanjing at the convergence of the Yangtze and the Luhe rivers. So it was a nodal point for shipboard and coastal communities. And at that time too, one of the most important natural resources was fresh water. And Taichung, the landmass of Taichung is about 30% water, and that's more than half of the area belonging to the Yangtze River Basin. So Taichung and Lujia Harbour, or Lujia Gang, is under the influence of the East Asian monsoon, which is again why it was used as a staging post for Zhonghe. It has a mild climate, and it's Meiyu, or monsoon season, starts in the middle of June, lasts for about 3 or 4 weeks, and that had an impact on the historical port activities. It's here about 350 miles downstream from Longjiang, and I'll come to that, just before the Yangtze meets the sea, that several underwater archaeological wreck objects were found. One of them is a grapnel anchor, which you can see here, dated to the Ming Dynasty. And the image there is from the exploitation of the works of nature, and it is a Ming Dynasty drawing of those grapnel anchors being forged. So we've got documentary evidence supporting underwater cultural heritage evidence of those activities at that point in time. That's a 758 kilogram Ming grapnel anchor, and that drawing is from 1637. Now, in that documentation, the author, which is Song Yingxin, spoke of the ships that were being seen and were available in Taichung at that time. And I particularly like this because he talks about the names of the ships being derived from their shapes, such as sea eel or river bream, or from what they can carry. And we know that Zhonghe's largest ships were called Bolchuan, or treasure ships, because of the amount of treasure that could be carried in their holds. So we're starting to see a really nice connection between what's in the environment, what's in the historical text, and what we're getting in the underwater archaeological assemblage. There are other, I guess, heritage sites that are still standing, such as the Celestial Temple, which has a stele that was erected in 1432 that describes the voyages. But we're seeing the kinds of ships from other sources as well. So these drawings here are from the Liangjiang Treasure Shipyard record. So we're seeing what's called a Fuchuan vessel and a Sichuan vessel. The Fuchuan vessels, and forgive my poor Chinese, those were the Fujian style vessels that were built in the south of China. And we've seen evidence with that, with some of those earlier shipwrecks that I showed you at the beginning. And the Shachuan or sand style vessels were more northern vessels that did coastal voyages. And we think possibly from the northern ports across to Korea and Japan. And that's similar to what we're seeing with the Shannan ship, the Chinese ship that was wrecked in Korea in about 1323. So we have further examples. Well, we have taken that information and created plans of what we think Zhonghe's treasure ship would have looked like. And that's based not only on those records, but on the archaeological assemblages that we're getting from Ming Dynasty. What I'm showing you here is that Longjiang Treasure Shipyard. It's built outside of Nanjing. You can see two of what were originally 7 docks, one with water in it and one without. The one without water was drained in 2003 for the excavation of that shipyard. And hopefully if you look closely, you can see some stakes sticking out of the ground. Those were used to hold the ships while it was being constructed. And then after the ship was ready, it would be refilled with water, as you can see in the second pond, and the ship would be floated to the east, which is to the back of the photo, out into the river, down the river, and where, at least for the Zhonghe voyages, they would wait at Taichung until they were ready to sail. We've got a drawing of the original layout of that treasure shipyard, and you can see that here on the left. And what's on the right is an 11-meter long rudder that was recovered from that shipyard excavation. along with a significant number of shipbuilding tools and other ships, fixtures and fittings. And this is a different show or different view of that axial rudder. And again, we've got written texts and further archaeological evidence of those specific rudder styles being used on ships of that period. So back to our map of the maritime Silk Route, I want to kind of bring us from China now back into Cambodia. And I hope you can see my little green circle there. It's the Cambodian coastline, which is only about 435 kilometers between Vietnam and Thailand, or what today is Vietnam and Thailand. And you can see on one of the smaller side routes, if you like, and that's where I'm going to take you now, specifically to that little yellow pin called the Kosadak Wreck, which is in the Kosadak archipelago. And I've talked, I've mentioned today treasure hunters, and it feels a little bit like I'm following, I should have 2 L's in following treasure hunters from China to Cambodia. But this particular wreck was significantly salvaged prior to 2011. This is an image of the treasure hunters or the salvors bringing broken ceramic back into port. And it seems that it wasn't just our friend Mike Hatcher who had been visiting Cambodia, but we have here the remains of those salvaged ceramics. So we don't know, and this is a site that I'm working on at the moment, we do not know how much was taken away. We believe that a significant amount of the Chinese porcelain was removed and sold, and there's around 900 remaining artifacts. Most of them are Thaiware, most of them are broken storage jars. These are some of the sampled ceramics, and I'm showing this to you because it's another, if you like, Silk Route shipwreck that evidences maritime contact between China and Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia. I have to be honest though, at this point, we do not know whether it is a Chinese wreck, a generic Southeast Asian wreck, and by that I mean something built of the South China Sea or Southeast Asian tradition. But what's interesting is we do have sample Chinese ceramics, and we have a Ming hand cannon. So these were, I understand, at least exclusively manufactured for the Ming military and used on naval ships or envoy ships and the Zhonghe voyages. And this wreck dates to 1428 to 1482. So early Ming dynasty, the earliest dates coincides with the Zhonghe voyages. But we have a record of around 46 voyages between China and Cambodia in that early Ming period between 14 and 1500. And that's taken from the Ming Shilu. And we have a similar number where we've got connections between, or voyages between, China and Thailand and China and Vietnam. And on that map, you can see that it's effectively, these islands are effectively on that dotted journey line between Vietnam and Thailand. So we potentially have a Chinese wreck. We certainly have maritime contact with China and Cambodia. And if Veronica is on the call, this is for you. And for Nancy, who took the photo, quite a number of years ago, they were recording some of the timbers that were recovered and abandoned by the salvors. We also have elephant tusk that has iron remnant on it. Whether or not it was used as an anchor, we don't know. And we've also got iron ingot. Now, I should say that the Baku wreck that Mike Fletcher worked on has evidence of the same ingots and similar Ming hand cannon, but of a slightly different style. So again, that was a Chinese wreck in, from memory, Indonesian waters. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but we're seeing further contact between the two. There's always a debate about whether treasure hunted sites are going to offer any archaeological value or any potential new knowledge. This wreck certainly is going to. And thanks to my colleagues in Cambodia who've done incredible conservation work, we'll be able to sample the inside of many of these jars to see what they were storing. And we also, and throwing back to Nancy again, have the same jars being found in the Cardamom Mountains that we're finding on this site. So this could potentially throw open our understanding of trade in the region far beyond what we've got simply between China and Cambodia, or China and Southeast Asia. While we're in Cambodia though, I want to just point you to the second little yellow pin there, which is Condor Reef. I feel again like I have to say that I'm starting to follow treasure hunters around Southeast Asia because Condor Reef was a site that was maybe investigated is too strong a word, but inspected by Mike Hatcher of Nanking Cargo fame. It is a huge granite reef submerged in about 25 meters of water. It's about 25 nautical miles also off the coast of Cambodia, and the Kosadak wreck is about 20 nautical miles, so this is 5 nautical miles further out. Hatcher has documented both through a video from which these stills are taken and his stories, evidence of a number of wrecks that have reported to have been lost around Condor Reef. You can see some of the material culture that's there. We're potentially looking at an English ship as well as Chinese or Asian ships from early Ming Dynasty right through to Qing Dynasty. So again, early 1400s up to 1700s. So it's potentially that this one is a bit of a ship trap. So I guess that's me coming to the end of my presentation and the sun setting on our discussion about the maritime Silk Route and connections with Cambodia. I just want to recap on some of those sites though that we've looked at, just in terms of mentioning Nanhai, Nan'ao, Huaguangjiao, Wanjiao, number one, and they're all number one because they're the first sites that the Chinese have found in those particular areas. And the potential archaeology that we're still investigating at Taichung as a significant port on the maritime Silk Route and of Sino-Foreign Maritime Exchange, and our Cambodian sites. And I've put a third one there. Several of you are aware that a newly found wreck also on the Cambodian coast, and also it appears to date to the early 1400s, maybe early 1500s, with the WTS for Watch This Space, because we will be surveying it next month. So no presentation would be complete without all of the thank yous, including to the Digital Museum, the various organisations that have funded and supported me, certainly since I started down this Zhonghe journey about 15 years ago. And I don't know whether it's my place to do this, but I guess I will throw it back to you, Jibunnessa, and to any questions that people might have. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was very, very interesting, and I'm sure lots of people have thoroughly enjoyed that. There are a number of questions in the Q&A, but before I go to those, if I may just, because there's you've covered such a lot of interesting ships and their contents, and obviously you've also discussed the dilemma of some of the treasure hunters' problems and the havoc that some of that has caused, but also the fact that you've found the ships because of them, in a way. What I would like, firstly, I mean, you've mentioned the organic preservation of some of the wooden constructions. Could you tell us a little bit more about the boat designs and constructions of some of the early like Nanhao One, and also you mentioned the Fushuan and the Sichuan boats, that they're different. If you could, just so that everybody can understand. Yeah,
big question.
I'm sorry.
Don't apologize. I could do another 3 days on that, as it is.
Yes, you're welcome.
Well, it wasn't me inviting myself. I guess, so the start of your question is about the preservation. And I think one of the incredible opportunities that underwater archaeology gives us is the incredible preservation of material. In one of my intro lectures, I like to put up 2 slides, one of the best preserved maritime or underwater archaeological sites, which is probably now a toss-up between the Nanhai one and Vasa in Sweden, and some of the best preserved land sites. And the difference is effectively we have footings of a building and some minor artifacts off these land sites, and we are getting intact, and particularly in the Baltic at the moment too, like intact shipwrecks. And in that area of the world, at least some of the rigging is still intact. So there is significantly greater preservation potential underwater than there is on land, and particularly of organic material like the timber. I think what is more interesting, at least to the non-conservators, is that 71% of the world is covered in water by oceans. 5% barely of that 71% has been explored. And then in some artifact classes, we have more than double the preservation rates of material. So the information that we can get from underwater archaeological sites is substantially more. So it gives us a substantially greater opportunity to learn about the past. And for me, that's incredibly exciting. For the treasure hunters, and you've mentioned it, so I have to come back to that. What it means is that there's significantly more material there that has potential economic value for them to want to and pursue the commercial exploitation of those sites, which is, for all the countries that have signed the UNESCO Convention, highly illegal, as it is now in Cambodia. So that's a little bit on the preservation. In terms of Asian ship design, there has been a lot of work done on the different I guess, facets of shipbuilding tradition in East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. In China, we see a really interesting north-south divide, but we don't just see that in shipbuilding. We see that in food, we see that in language, even today, significant cultural differences between North and South. But historically, ships were built for their environment, built for their operating environment, were dependent on the materials in the environment in which they were built. So in certain areas, you've got different kinds of timber. we've got different, when I say operating conditions, it's bringing me back to the Fuchuan and the Sichuan. And sorry to Wei and my Chinese colleagues, my Fayin Bohao Jintian, my accent's very bad tonight. In the north of China, we have really shallow seas with large coastal shoals that change significantly over time. So the Sichuan, the sand style vessels, are named because they are built with shallower drafts, less deep kind of hull form to navigate those shallow coastal waters and navigate over those sand shoals, which are constantly changing. And the Fuchuan style is a deeper draft, what we would think of as an open ocean going vessel built in Fujian, which at that time was the seafaring, I guess, capital, and the origin of many of the vessels that went to the Indian Ocean on those further journeys. So you're building them for where they're going. You're building them with what you have available, with the people and resources that you have available, and a range of other factors. I hope that goes some way to answering that.
Yeah, no, it does, and I guess we can all sort of investigate further if we want to look at the finer details of the constructions. And I mean, the other thing, you mentioned the livestock and the growing of plants on board. Can you talk a little bit about that? What sort of livestock would they have taken with them? Because you've got organic remains that you found of animal and plant, so if you could just talk a little bit about what sort of plants they were growing on board ship, and the animals, how that was managed.
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly from the Zhonghe voyages, we have good written records. And I feel like I have to couch that somewhat when we're talking about China, because China's amazing for so many reasons. And one of those is that their written history goes back thousands of years. In Australia, it goes back barely 300 since European occupation. So we've got fantastic written records. We've got amazing preservation of archaeological sites, and we've got the ability to compare the two. But we also have a history of two things in China, and that is, we all know history is written by the victors. So when one emperor threw another emperor out, the records were altered in certain occasions to remove that emperor. But in terms of shipbuilding, a lot of the records in relation to the Zhonghe voyages were burned after the voyages for similar reasons, I guess to minimize the importance of those voyages down the ages. But what we do know is that he had certain classes of vessels. He had water ships, he had horse ships, he had troop ships, passenger ships, et cetera, and we have written records. And although we don't have I want to say archaeological evidence of a Zhonghe ship, we have it in the shipyards, but not in the ships themselves, particularly the treasure ship. We know that they were growing gardens on the ship. They were making water. They were taking livestock for two reasons: one for food, and the other, the horses particularly, for the soldiers that were on the troop ships. Yeah. So Captain Cook's people had scurvy.
Yeah, you mentioned
they didn't.
Sorry. Yeah, you mentioned the animal and plant remains. So those, you're taking the sort of talking about the gardens and the livestock. You're taking that from the historical record, but the archaeological evidence, without that historical record, would not have got you to that conclusion necessarily. It's not extensive enough to say.
Yeah, it's not extensive enough, but And I thank you for bringing that up, actually, because I think it's important to, where you've got written records, to use those to inform your archaeology. And sometimes your archaeology proves and sometimes it disproves what's in the written record. We're very fortunate here to have, both, and to apply those as we need to.
Yeah, thank you. So I've got a lot of, oh gosh, I've got a, where to start? Start from the top. So
That's why I muted myself. I could see them all coming in, and when I was talking. So yeah. Apologies for
that. Yeah, so Lauren Michael asked, any discoveries, artifacts coming from Guangzhou? My pronunciation is going to be very lacking, but I'll do my best. So Guangzhou, is it Guangzhou? Guangzhou Maritime Museum. Any discoveries from there?
From Guangzhou. I just wanted to have a look at your typings. Thanks, Lauren. Look, I didn't talk about the Guangzhou ship, I think, because it has had such coverage, and I know that a lot of the work that's going on now, although it's well publicized and well published in China, it's not really that accessible to non-Chinese speakers. So the Guangzhou ship is dated, I think, to 1277. It was a coastal trading ship. We think of the Sichuan style that was excavated in the 1970s. Correct me to the other archaeologists on the call if I'm misremembering. And there was, I think, up to about 17,000 artifacts that came from that. So at the time, it was considered the greatest find because that was well before China had decided to develop its maritime archaeology capability. So yes, absolutely substantial find there. There certainly was also another grapnel anchor that had come out of Guangzhou Bay, similar to the picture that I showed you. That was also dated to Ming Dynasty based on its topology, but no metallurgy or any other analysis had been done to narrow down that date. And as it was an isolated find from a harbour, it can't be truly connected to Zhonghe or any other particular voyage.
Okay, I'm going to actually, I think Professor Himanshu Prabharoy has a number of questions. So what I'm going to do, Himanshu, is I'm going to actually promote you and let you ask them yourself. That might be, then you can ask them fully, if I can find her in this lovely list. Ah, yes. So I'm just going to. So you're promoted now, Himanshu. So if you can have a little chat with Sarah yourself. Himanshu, you just need to unmute yourself and.
Oh, hello, Sarah. That was great. I really enjoyed it. I have two questions. One is, treasure hunting was a big part of your talk. And I also, China hasn't signed the UNESCO 2001 convention, right?
No, it hasn't.
But it has taken steps to guard against treasure hunting. So that kind of legislation, I think would be very important to know. If you could, talk a bit more about the legislation and what's being done to protect these, because as you know, treasure hunting and underwater archaeology is a really big issue. So that was my first question. And my second question was, you talked about the Wanjiu 1 as a private ship. And now I wasn't sure whether I got it right. So are you contrasting it between, private and state, or, what's the significance of this private ship?
It's interesting you should ask that, because I was thinking that as well earlier. I was going to ask myself, but yeah.
I feel like I just want to start there and say at this point, I don't think that has been confirmed. It's just a hypothesis because it's a significantly more smaller ship. was only about 13 meters, and most of those larger, let me rephrase that. It was only about 13 meters. And I think most of the trading ships or merchant ships that went on, certainly to India and across to Africa, were significantly larger. We're seeing them constantly between kind of 20 to maybe 35 meters. But there's the least amount of work has been done on that. So once I get more, I'll certainly let you guys know about that. It's just a hypothesis that it might have been smaller because it was private, because it was such a smaller vessel. But mind you, we think that most of the, and I'm going to say Silk Route shipwrecks, and I know that's a problematic phrase in its own, but we think that many of them were private vessels. Some were chartered by the state, but some were an individual owner taking consignments of cargo. And Nanhai 1, each of those compartments that you saw has artifacts that have different makers' marks on them. So it appears to be that each cargo was a different manufacturer sending his wares abroad. And so someone was either chartering the ship, or it was a private merchant taking other makers' goods. So it probably wasn't the best use of the term when I said that, but just private as in a smaller operator, effectively, but it's yet to be proven. And the treasure hunters, you're right. I certainly didn't set out to spend all of my time talking about it. But when you dig back into even the significant finds in China, a lot of them were found by treasure hunters. And what I chose not to do, other than I'm obliged, I feel, to mention the Nanking cargo when you're talking about the development of maritime archaeology or underwater archaeology in China, but I haven't talked about the hundreds of wrecks that were treasure hunted and commercially exploited before Nanking cargo or the Geldermalsen find prompted the development. China's #1 priority now, though, is protection of its wrecks. So there is no public access to them. You can't go and dive them. The locations, the exact locations, aren't being shared. So it doesn't have an obligation to promote public access because it isn't a party to the convention, which you're absolutely right in saying. It has indicated that it will sign. I don't think that indication has formally been given to UNESCO. So what they're doing at the moment is trying to work on archaeologically salvaging the significant wrecks, making sure that they're protected before they ratify, but also to demonstrate that China is meeting the obligations and doing work to a standard that would be required of the UNESCO Convention. Regarding the legislation, there is underwater cultural heritage legislation now, which has standard basic provisions of reporting and penalties for doing the wrong thing, which includes jail time. It could be, that's at a national level. Most of the provinces have their own both heritage legislation, and coastal provinces have either shipwreck or the heritage legislation extends into the water. The details are fairly standard. I think they're all on a significance basis. They're not on a year basis. So each site needs to be assessed and protected. So that would need to change upon ratification or in preparation for ratification to make blanket protection. The key thing though is you can't dive coastal waters without permission. So it's a little bit like Greece was before it's opening up. You just can't get in the water and go and find something. And even some of the inland sites, of which there are dozens I could have talked to you about, the diving there is heavily restricted now too. So we're looking at some of the, I guess, the same security measures that were implemented in some of the European states while they were developing their underwater archaeology capability. Because if China opens up these sites, it's absolutely going to be a free-for-all, and it doesn't have the capacity to control the theft.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. Himanshu, did you have another question? You had two questions, I think you mentioned.
I did ask them, but following up from what you were saying, Sarah, about nobody being allowed to go into the water or diving. But
No.
what about adventure tourism, which is a big thing, scuba diving? These are big things in all the countries. So how do you stop all of this?
There is, you can in Hainan Island in the south. Like, I should couch it, because there are diving operators and you can dive. And if Steve's on the call, he probably knows more about this than I do. So certain diving operators have permits to take divers to certain sites, but those are going to be mainly reef systems, like standard recreational diving. If they identify a wreck, then it automatically goes up to the Underwater Archaeology Bureau and the Cultural Heritage Underwater Archaeology Unit of the Cultural Heritage Administration for assessment, and automatically that's closed.
And we're hoping that nobody's going to do it by stealth under the guise of looking at fish.
You would end up, at a minimum, you would be arrested and put in jail. At maximum, there'd be significant fines. But I have to say that China is actually a very law-abiding country, and particularly now that there's a social credit system in place. I'm just going to say, in my own Australian terminology, nobody in their right mind would go and loot a shipwreck if you're a Chinese citizen in Chinese waters, because it just simply would not be worth it. The challenge is keeping out the treasure hunters and the looters from those sites that are further offshore.
Yeah. John Sexton asked a question about the canals. So the largest canals using magnetometers and ground penetrating sonars and the like. So
hi, John.
Yeah. So
I'm just going back to where he's written that no systematic search has been performed on either the Grand Canal or Lingchu. I'm really interested in Lingchu. It's one of the sites that we've been looking at in the inland water transport project, and we did a site visit there. In some places it's really incredibly shallow, but what it's interesting for is the earliest locks and weirs and the earliest canal engineering. So that's quite significant, but no archaeological work has been done on Lingchu at all. I've been asked to be on the World Heritage nomination team, and I put that question to them myself. So there's nothing. And the Grand Canal, the sites that have been found are only when they've been dredging them, as you would with a port access, just to allow ships to continue. And it seems silly given the potential, but there's just so much material here. And even though there's a huge underwater archaeology unit, the focus is really offshore at the moment. And part of that's for the protection, and part of that's for the interest in gaining further knowledge about the ancient maritime Silk Route and Silk Route trade.
Yeah, that's I mean, but it's definitely ripe for a lot more investigation. And you mentioned the engineering. Is there a sort of if people want to read more about the engineering of the locks, because that could be quite interesting because of the antiquity of and being the first in the world to design these. If there's any any suggestions of things that people could look at, that would be, do you have any suggestions?
Oh, I can certainly send some things through. There's been, Ling Chu's really interesting. There is a draft World Heritage nomination on the UNESCO site, which talks about the history of Ling Chu Canal, or it's Ling Canal, but in Chinese, Ling Chu. And it's phenomenally interesting if you are an engineering buff. There has also been a number of small boats pulled out of the canals, and I can see that Paul Montgomery is on the call too, and he used to live in Liucheng, which is at one end of the Grand Canal, and the museum there has some significant examples of inland watercraft, as does, and the canal engineering, as does the Shanghai Maritime Museum. But look, there will be some books coming out probably in the next 2 years. One that we're producing from our centre on the history and development of Chinese inland water transport, and it's pretty much going to contain an inventory of all known sites and archaeological evidence related to that. Yeah, initially it'll be in Chinese, but I'm going to have a translated version put out. So that might be closer to 4 or 5 years because we've got to get the Chinese version out. But I'm happy to share whatever I come across with you guys, because I think I know many of you. But he's right. It seems like it's a no-brainer, but the focus really at the moment is looking to the sea.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that can offer China.
You actually mentioned submerged settlements or submerged structures. So they're sort of quite extensive. Have you done any work on the harbours and docks?
Oh, yeah, the submerged. I'm going to squirm a bit now because this is getting into some interesting territory for China, but several prehistoric submerged sites have been found in the Shisha and Nansha Islands. And a few years ago, there was a mandate to focus on the South China Sea and the islands in the South China Sea when China was putting its case up to the International Court about the 9 Dash Line. There hasn't been, to my knowledge, any open publications about those sites other than the documentation that was put up to The Hague. And I think that they haven't been fully investigated yet. Those other 10 shipwrecks that I mentioned haven't been fully investigated either. But certainly that's China's focus, not only in connections with what are now called the Belt and Road countries, but it is looking at the history of China's contact with those countries, hence the term Silk Route shipwrecks, and the focus on the South China Sea.
Yeah. Okay, I think Steve Gallagher, he's asking about Zhenghe. Is there evidence to support claims he reached modern-day Kenya? Well, you actually mentioned certain parts of Africa.
This is like a one of our
friends renewed.
Yeah, look, I think there's documentary evidence that he reached Kenya or Eastern Africa. There is, to my knowledge, no shipwreck evidence, although there is, in one of the annals, the account of survivors of a ship wrecking from the Zhonghe fleet, and there's a description of where they travelled to get back to China. In Malindi, there was significant excavations done on the port of Malindi in Kenya that produced a huge amount of material, early Ming Dynasty, including coins from Yongle reign. There are thought to be shipwreck sites. I don't know if Caesar's on the call, but but there were 2 or 3 wreck sites that were identified, but at that time there wasn't the capacity to investigate them because they were deep, and they were producing early Ming porcelain in the Lamu Islands in northern Kenya near to the Somali border. There are Ming tombs and there are again Ming coins, but tombs aside, the rest of it's movable. So we don't know whether it's Zhonghe related. We don't know whether it's trading vessels or whether it was taken by Arab traders or et cetera, et cetera. So it's a long way of saying unconfirmed.
Yeah. I think Shubham Biswas would like you to talk a little bit about goods on ships that are of non-Chinese origin. So Vietnamese or Korean goods that might be on Chinese or other vessels.
Yes, so that's an excellent question. Gosh, where to start? The short answer is yes. So for my Portuguese friends, there is clearly a lot of Chinese material in Portuguese sites, and I know Tanya's not here, but Alexander might be. But we also have Portuguese sites in China. So we've got a Portuguese kind of port site that's producing Portuguese material in China. We have records of English East Indiamen, Dutch East Indiamen that were coming to and from mainland China and Taiwan. So we've got Chinese material on those other ships. In Thailand, if Pook's around, we've got Chinese material on Thai vessels and Thai material on Chinese vessels. In the Cambodian example that I gave you, most of what you were seeing in those photos was Thai pottery, which makes it really interesting for me, not because of the specific kind of connection between China and Thailand, because that's certainly well documented, but there is in the Mingxi Lu accounts of Thai king giving tribute to China and storage jars being noted as like 1,000 storage jars being noted as the tribute that was being given to the Chinese king. So we've potentially got
storage jars.
Say again.
The content in the storage jars. What was in them?
They're just jars.
Oh right, okay. The jars were lovely enough.
Yeah. And we've actually got accounts. There's one account of one of the Chinese envoys going to Vietnam, I think, or Annam at the time. And it's a list of all of the tribute that's being given. So I feel like I'm not giving you a good answer. I'm just going to check your question because there is a significant amount of to and fro.
I think you've given a sort of scale of interaction, but if you could just go into some of the like, for example, you mentioned Thai material and Portuguese material. If you could just sort of say what sort of things were traded on these ships that were found that were of a different origin.
Oh, good question. So we've got on the Portuguese side, and what I'm calling the Portuguese side in southern China, that's predominantly ceramic. There's no Portuguese shipwreck per se. We've got.
Was the ceramic influenced by Chinese styles?
And I wish Tanya was on the call. So part of what we're doing at the moment is, sorry, forgive me for going a little bit away from the question, is that this volume that we're trying to create at the moment is trying to pull together international researchers' work on the connections. So, because it's not been really, our focus has been looking from China out, and the majority of course, right? It's a Chinese national research project funded by the Ministry of Education, and large majority of my colleagues are historians, and there is still a belief in China to a certain extent that the documents are the truth, that the documents are all you need when looking at that. So I've tried to offset that documentary focus and that Chinese focus, which we are publishing in one book, with an international volume with international researchers. And one of the authors, I don't know if he's on the call, is trying to look at Chinese influence on Portuguese shipbuilding. Another is looking at Chinese influence on Portuguese porcelain designs and vice versa. We've got somebody else looking at connections, I guess, with Sri Lanka. And we know, I guess, coming back to the Chinese side, that the Chinese were altering their porcelain designs to suit the local market. And that's what we see really heavily in Nanhai 1. So there's to the point that it's even called export wear, because the Chinese tastes were very specific. So in order to be good traders, you would adapt your style to, so we've got goods going to Middle East that have got a more Middle Eastern flourish, certainly with Persian designs on them. So it is probably a bigger question than I can answer at the moment, but I'm just double checking. But
when
yes,
is the journal coming out? The research.
Well, hopefully next year.
So, okay, so we don't have to wait too long.
This is a short one. Yes, absolutely. So the one I mentioned that might be a little bit longer, that's the water transport volume. So that's coming out in Chinese early next year. And we just need to raise the funds to get that into English. I think it's really important that we do. One monograph from the Sino-Foreign Maritime Exchange, which is predominantly text-based Chinese historical sources. That'll be in Chinese, but that won't be for another two years, maybe. And the edited volume that I'm talking about, we are pushing to get this done by the end of next year. So I really want to see that we present a balanced view. So I've pushed to have a second volume which looks at the material evidence, so archaeology and cultural heritage, from international researchers, so that we can deliver a fuller picture, a more well-rounded picture of what was going on at the time.
Well, that sounds excellent and very interesting, and I hope you're going to keep us updated on when that's going to come out.
Absolutely, I would love to.
Very interested in having a look at that. Minu Kanogia asks about, Kanogia asks about your why such huge quantities of porcelain and ceramic wares. Was some of it to do with balancing the ship?
Oh, good question. And thank you for your kind words. Look, I'll go to the Nanhai 1. Now that was wrecked pretty much as soon as it left China. So the reason we've got in excess of 160,000 objects now is it was fully laden. It went pretty much out of the Pearl River or offshore of the Pearl River Delta and sank. So it hadn't gone to another port. So it was ready to go. And that's the simple answer as why it's got so much on it. The Geldermalsen, we think, was leaving China fully laden with the cargo to go back to the Netherlands. So same thing, sank very close to the Nanhai 1, so just 20 miles offshore. So where we're getting things that have done their journeys or are partway through their journeys, like we've had maybe with the Baku wreck that Mike Flecker did and several of the others that have been found kind of in Southeast Asia, they've partly offloaded some of it. So you're getting kind of 10, 20,000 objects, a bit like well, I was going to say a bit like the wreck in the Shisha Islands, but that's been heavily looted. So we think too that was on its way out, but all that remains is, 10 to 17,000. So it just depends where it was on its journey.
Yeah.
Like modern ships.
Yeah. Paul Montgomery asks about fishing vessels. So do you have much material from fishing vessels and learned about fishing methods from them?
I want to say, I think that's a project for you, Paul, for when you come back to China. We haven't, certainly at the centre here, we haven't focused on that because we're being paid to focus on these other two projects. With the Inland Water Transport project, I have identified fishing vessels in museums, and I guess for me that's my prime focus for that project at the moment, is archaeological evidence that's already been recovered. But I haven't done any further research on them. It's just identifying at the moment and inventorying what's where. But yeah, we've got ancient evidence of ancient nets and basketry. We've got evidence of ancient stone fish weirs. And one of the guys contributing to our volume is looking at the connections between Japan and China, between the technology transfer for those ancient fish traps and fish weirs. So no, not as much as I would like, but you can pick that up when you come back to China.
So there's an invitation for you, Paul. Well, we've come to the end of our time. We've had you in for longer than we'd planned. I mean, we could actually talk to you all day, Sarah, because there's so many interesting things to discuss. I would hopefully, if you've got your volume out next year, we'll have a look at that, and I'd love to invite you again to talk on something else. That'll be very interesting, and I'm sure everybody will look forward to that. So thank you very much for coming and giving us such an excellent talk and such an interesting discussion afterwards as well. And thank you everybody else, for all of you for coming today and being so enthusiastic in your questions. So thank you very much, everybody.